very good evening to you. Welcome to another Newsmaker Live broadcast right here on the DBS television. My name is Timothy Polion. We'll be together until 10 o'clock this evening. We were not on last week because of the budget presentation. And as a matter of fact, that is what we'll be speaking about this evening. The just presented 2018-2019 fiscal package of $1.4 billion. Last year's budget was $1.5 billion, and this year's budget, the theme for the budget was building resilience today to secure our future. And definitely we heard from the various parliamentarians regarding the budget presentation. We heard from the man who's on the screen right now, the MP for Vieux-Fort South and former St. Lucia Prime Minister Dr. Kenny Anthony. By the way, last year's budget was titled Building a New St. Lucia. That's because it was the first budget presented by the new Prime Minister following the 2016 general election. For the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, as far as he sees it, the government has been doing very well, recording economic growth in the region of 2.5%, and also making reference to a reduction in the rate of unemployment, standing right now at 20.1%. But the niggling issue continues to be youth unemployment, and that's at 38.5%. In the case of the opposition, St. Lucia Labour Party, just yesterday, the leader of the parliamentary opposition, Mr. Philip JPS, stated that the budget is nothing but a list of dreams and aspirations with no strategy for their realization. I brought in a guest for us to dissect the budget, and he is no other than Mr. Richard Pitterkin, Chartered Accountant. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you, Timothy.
Let's talk about last year's budget before we look into the presentation for this year. What do you make of last year's budget, and what do you think came out of it?
Before I say anything, just a little preamble, because it's been a while since I've been on your show. In fact, the last time I was on was June of 16, just before the elections.
And you made some news, huh?
And following the show, snippets of shots were used, kind of out of context, and as a political attack ad on social media. And I kind of never forgot that. For that and other reasons, I decided to take a sabbatical and to just kind of pull back a little bit. I was probably too exposed anyway. And, you know, because the political environment in Lucia is very tribal. Not just in Lucia, I mean, it's all over the world, you see it in the States as well. And unfortunately, we seem unable to be objective and take a look at strategies, policies, whatever, and try and say, you know, what is positive about things, what is negative, and come to that kind of conclusion. But, you know, I think we need perhaps to have more meaningful dialogue on things like the budgets and other matters. And certainly, I'm always happy to come here and try and help. Now, your question is overall impressions, or at least in terms of what was or has not been achieved. I didn't, you know, go down a list to see, you know, compare last budget to see what was done and what was not done. But, you know, one of the commentaries that was put out by one of my competitors actually did that. And you know, you would see in here they talked about things that weren't implemented and were implemented. And there were some things that were in the budget that are not being done. There was talk about personal income tax reform, and that was not implemented. You know, there were changes in the VAT and in some of the other miscellaneous taxes. But it appears to me that last year's budget was not that specific in terms of a number of things that were going to get done. They talked more in terms of long-term plans. And one of my overall impressions, and when you look at whether in fact government achieved its objectives or not, is really not just based on what the actual budget address was, or even what the debate was, because I didn't see the address and I didn't listen to the debate. You know, but at the same time, I reviewed the speech and the estimates and the review of the economy, all of which are good documents that, you know, would at least assist you in trying coming to an impression. You know, I have reviewed budgets now for over 15 years, and not surprisingly, I'm often struck by the similarity in terms of the objectives and the themes like resilience, sustainability, fiscal stability. And this budget didn't stray from these economic moorings. Great, which I'm glad to see, because I believe at the end of the day, the Prime Minister and the government realizes, like others have done before him, that government does not really have a lot of fiscal options in terms of what it can and cannot achieve, given our size, given the environment that surrounds us, and to that extent, they have to work within a certain, narrow parameters in order to achieve their policies and their plans. Where this government was different, to my mind, was in its priorities and policies, which they are now saying would address these issues. Now, government is really just an administration's plans and announcements as to what they will do. But in this case, what I noticed was a reorientation of certain policies and principles, one of which, for example, is that the individual is more important than the system, and they're beginning to put in, and that social programs by themselves, unless they're sustainable, cannot really be implemented that would benefit people. So the question of whether it would achieve the budget is really depends to a large extent, not on what necessarily is in it, but on the economic environment that surrounds us. And this is one of the interesting things, because the environment that we are presently in is one in which it's going to make it easier for this government to implement a number of the proposals that they have.
Why?
Well, just to give you an example, 4 or 5 things. Economic growth in our main tourist markets, for example, especially the U.S., which now accounts for almost 50% of our stayover arrivals.
Increased by what, 14%?
The actual increase? No, I think it was 10 or 11. But what I'm saying is the economic growth in the U.S., in the U.K. is all strong, and it's benefiting us in terms of people coming here. In previous years, you didn't have that level of growth, so we didn't benefit to that extent. What we're now seeing is a greater investor appetite for investment in St. Lucia, especially from Barbados, Jamaica, and other international countries. I mean, I live in Fiji, and the amount of private jets that fly into Fiji now on a daily basis, I wish I knew who they were. I can meet clients, but I mean, it's actually quite interesting. There is a lot of interest. Then around us is an increased appetite for government bonds, government treasury bills, from the investor community that needs to buy instruments, banks, insurance companies, etc. And as a result of that, because they are buying the bonds and the treasury bills, a lot of these instruments are fully subscribed, which means that the government can reduce the rate of borrowing, as well as improve our maturity profile. So that in fact makes it easier to borrow and easier to finance government programs. We didn't get the hurricane damage that the islands to the north of us did. So to that extent, we're benefiting from that. I mean, there was a friend that called me, and he was trying to get his jet parked in Huanora over the Easter, and they told him there was no space. So when I called to see if I can assist, they said, well, the only reason why there's no space is because the jets that used to land in Dominica and other places could no longer go there. And so we were picking up that slack. It was the same with tourists and cruise ships. So again, that was not, it's unfortunate for those islands, but we benefited from the fact that they had that damage.
So hold on there, Mr. Peterkin.
Yeah.
So when the government is, and I think this was an issue that was highlighted during the budget debate, that when the government is saying that the economy is doing well and the St. Lucia performed well to the extent that it recorded growth in the amount of 2.5%, the opposition is countering by saying, boy, the hurricane did not impact us, so you're benefiting from this, and also the investment climate, where, for example, the United States economy is doing well, and therefore foreign direct investment would increase in the case of St. Lucia, and likewise the UK and so on. It has nothing to do with the stewardship of the government, do you think?
Not entirely, because these are not factors that we control, right? Another two, for example, that over the last year or so, the pound and the euro have both been strengthening against the US dollar. Now that's good news for tourism, because it makes our product more competitive. Similarly, oil prices, even though they rose a little bit last year, they have dropped 70% since 2014, and they've remained, at a level which allows us to, keep the prices reasonably low. And then the IMF has now said that we're going to have, 3.9% growth in 18 and 19. None of these are things that we control, that we did. But at the same time, life is such that when something good is going on around you, if you can take advantage of that to the benefit of yourself and the people that you're governing, then that's good stewardship. So to that extent, I don't think there's really a lot in the budget last year that suggests that has brought about necessarily this growth, but they certainly took advantage of the situation to do some things that clearly are going to benefit.
So you think, against the background of all what you've just said, that the tribalism would be preventing us from narrowing our attention to the economic growth compared to what caused the economic growth? Because when you're talking about economic growth, the government as in office is the one that will politically benefit from all the positive news.
Correct. And, as I've said before, I mean, it is my opinion that during the 5 years that Dr. Anthony was in office, that he, if nothing else, he stabilized the economy. It could have been worse, and we saw it in worse in some other countries. My own belief is that he had, prudentially, he avoided heavy deficits, etc. To some extent, he didn't have a lot of options. But at least now that the tide has turned around us, and they say that, when economic tide improves, then all boats float. And so to some extent, by at least keeping the things stable, now this government will benefit. But you have to give them credit for some things that they're obviously doing right, because if not, it would be worse off than that. Perhaps you wouldn't see the growth. But the thing about that growth, if you look at the OECS, for example, there are 4 or 5 countries that had better growth than us: Antigua, St. Kitts, Grenada. We were only, I think, above St. Vincent and one other. But at least it's growth, because we didn't have this kind of growth in the years before that, and that's one of the things that was killing us. And now if we can continue to get growth of 2.5, 3%, 3.5, that's what's going to make a difference to this country in the years ahead.
But what do you think that the government ought to do to build on that foundation, the 2.5% foundation? Because I'm sure that we'd be doing a lot better if we can record growth in the region of 5 and 6%.
Correct. And well, this is what, for them anyway, this budget was all about. That given that growth, given the improved conditions around us, we are now in a position to do things that we believe, in the long run, will really and truly make St. Lucia a stronger economy, reduce unemployment, improve our living standards, provide good health care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they are premising a lot of what they intend to do on that. As I will get to it later on, the only negative things, a lot of the negative things will be a question of what happens if we don't get those favorable conditions. Mm-hmm. What do we do then? But we'll get to that point.
Now, we're attributing the growth to strong recovery in tourism and increased activity in construction, wholesale and retail and manufacturing sectors, with positive spin-offs on other sectors. Those seem to be the same areas that we always refer to when we're talking about whether the economy has done well or not. Is it time to change, our mode of operation or what we depend on for economic growth? Look at agriculture to do more?
Well, I mean, this government said when they were in opposition that, agriculture had to be a more viable sector, and when they came in, that they would bring in measures to make it so. That was the intent. That obviously has not changed in the last year. If anything, the agriculture sector declined. Again, external factors to some extent impact on that. But you can't turn things around if the rest of the world is not buying your product, if your product is too expensive, the quality is not good enough, if you can't produce in the right numbers. And so it's easy to say it, harder to do it. The fact of the matter is, St. Lucia, like many other countries in the Caribbean, now are so dependent on tourism that sometimes it's scary. Because at the end of the day, it makes us vulnerable to shocks that affect tourism, but at the same time, it does produce growth. And if we can manage it well, and if we can make sure that the benefits come down to, to assist people at all levels, then it can be a wonderful industry, as it is in many other countries in the world. I mean, places like Spain and so on depend, significantly on that. but they're big enough countries that you have everything else. We are one of the most diversified in the OECS because we do have agriculture. Look at countries like Antigua, there's no agriculture. It's almost all tourism. But we don't have oil like Trinidad, and we don't have other resources like Jamaica. So we need to look at, you know, whatever other industries we can get into.
But do you think we're
services,
just too complacent, lackadaisical in terms of finding new industries, new areas of economic activity?
No, I think for years, you know, the advisors, the economists, the governments have been trying to find something to diversify our economy. The European Union, with all the assistance and grants that they gave us when bananas started to, you know, go down, we have been unable to diversify even the agricultural sector, much less the rest of the economy.
What is preventing us from doing that? We have the technical know-how, we have the human resource personnel well trained in the Ministry of Agriculture. At one time, I think there was even a diversification unit in the ministry.
To the best of my knowledge. But it comes down to demand. It comes down to critical mass. We're small. You can come up with all the different products that we can grow. But the question
but while we have this, all right, irrespective of our size and everything else, we still have a huge food import bill that we can cut on.
We do, and it's one of the, you know, the areas that there's no government seems to be able to have any major impact on that. I look, for example, at Jamaica that produces 70% of its food needs for the tourist industry, and we're half of that. And it's not impossible, but it does require, you know, assistance to the private sector that are in that area to ensure that they stay in it and they can produce. I mean, I met with, recently in Jamaica, I met with the people who produce chickens for the country and the people who are the big bakers. And I was amazed at the scale of their operations, the efficiency of their operations, and the fact that these people, if they wanted, could actually be in export, and they don't need to be, because they can provide the local market with all of its needs. And that's what we need to get to. And I sometimes wonder if, you know, yes, size is a problem, but I believe that in some instances, the people that are in it need a little bit of assistance, a little bit of maybe external and certainly money, so that they don't depend on things like having to buy a certain percentage of a particular product locally, or a negative list which they don't allow anymore, or protection for an industry if the price is not right or the quality is not good. What you really want is to produce industries that can come up with a product or products that they can sell to the tourist industry, that are competitive with what they could import from other parts of the world, and have the right quality and the right price. And that's always the tough thing for them to do.
But I don't think from the perspective of any government that is presiding over the affairs of St. Lucia right now, an inhibiting factor would be the bad experience St. Lucia had in terms of subsidizing the banana industry, to the tune of paying the debt to the tune of millions of dollars. I mean, the last one was about, what, 35 million or thereabout?
Correct. Yeah.
Do you think that is what is discouraging governments funding to subsidize agriculture, other aspects of agriculture?
I just don't think government has a choice, because they cannot get the money to subsidize anything these days. And this is the problem. If, you know, you look at Europe and you look at America, and their farmers get tremendous subsidies. Japan, the same thing. But they are financially able to borrow the money, sometimes from their own population in the case of Japan, or from China in the case of the US, to create those subsidies. We cannot. You know, even if we wanted to, there's no way you can borrow $100 million simply to prop up the price of an agricultural product, or to, you know, increase the assistance to manufacturers to produce products at the right price. We just can't. So that's another constraint which we have not been able to address or deal with, because it's, you know, and even if we did, the world now has moved on beyond protectionism. Notwithstanding that we live in the era of Trump, in which he wants to build walls and protect local industries, because America is big enough they can do and say these things. We can't. And if we try to do that, we end up losing, because the very countries that provide us right now with tourism and whatnot can work against us in ways that you know, we would not be able to win.
So therefore, should the private sector invest in agriculture directly?
They should. But the private sector is profit-oriented. And, you know, generally they will either use equity or they will borrow money and get into a particular business or industry in the hope that they can make a profit, pay their shareholders, pay dividends. And the fact is that agriculture, without subsidies, is not going to make a profit. They've seen that, they've been unwilling, it's hard work getting labor, and the margins are low. So for that reason, they have gone into other things, services, real estate, that might produce better profits and better profits. And it's going to be very difficult. They've tried incentives over the years to attract people to go into agriculture, and that didn't work. Because at the end of the day, as I say, it's just the profits.
But help me understand that. But if we have a huge food import bill again, and we're importing so many produce that we ourselves can harvest can produce in St. Lucia, and shouldn't we be plowing that money into those sectors so they become self-sufficient? Wouldn't that not work?
But again, I mean, the question, it still becomes demand and supply, right? Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of the products that they use, the inputs that they use in tourism, can be and are imported from overseas. When you look at the prices of the things that they import, for us to produce them at that price will now require a subsidy. And that's just not sustainable. And that's one of the issues. You cannot sustain, and that whole, other than those countries who, for various reasons, political and economic, can continue to do so and borrow the money to do so, we just can't. And so as much as there appears to be a big demand for a lot of things that the tourism industry needs, our ability to meet that demand at the right price, at the right quality, as I say, is going to require a level of support that governments can't sustain.
The nation which produced Sir Arthur Lewis cannot find an economic model, to look at its various economic challenges and problems, because early on you said that, for example, the economy grew by 2.5%, and it's based on a number of external factors. And you are fearing that, God forbid, if the environment changes externally, what is on the horizon for us?
Yeah.
Luck will have to be on the side?
Well, we do need a plan B. We need to be more flexible. We need to at least, every time one of the assumptions that we make about what is keeping this policy going, what allows us to do what we do, does not or goes the wrong way, that we can adjust accordingly. And we have a lot of bright people in this country. The policy that Sir Arthur had way back when, we can't use any longer, right? Because the world has changed. And he would have changed, I think, if he was still alive, and he would have come up with some different policies. But it's no longer just the intelligence of what to do that is missing. We have that intelligence. It's the ability to do it, the ability to implement it, the fact we'll be competing with countries big and small all over the world, many of whom are trying to do the same thing in the Caribbean alone. And so for us to achieve that, it takes a lot of skill to balance and manage our economy and to get the kind of growth and to keep your people happy, without, as I say, running into the kind of problems that you get in some other countries.
You have to take a lot of seemingly unnecessary risks?
Not necessarily, but as I say, if you had managed well over time, the level of the risk goes down. But you will always have risk in doing anything, whether it be private or public, because that risk we have, in running getting a budget for a year, for example. There's so many risks that they have to deal with, and they have to come up with a policy for each and every one of them. But it's not just about being defensive. It's about taking the offense and doing things that are actually mitigating those risks, creating resilience, as prime ministers for years have talked about, and then taking advantage of the good things as they come along.
But we're not a people that like change. And this prime minister has given the impression that he's not about to repeat some of the policies and initiatives and actions that were taken by previous administrations. There is some kind of retaliation, if you want to put it this way, on the part of certain sections of the St. Lucian society, and in particular the opposition. Do you believe that that could serve as a deterrent in terms of the government going ahead with its policies, fiscal and otherwise, so that it wants to reap certain rewards, but taking certain chances that could prove deleterious in the end?
Of course, because every policy that they implement that requires, for example, more taxation, that requires more borrowing, that requires that you are able to achieve the things you say that you can, if they don't turn out, or if you get sufficient resistance from the implementation, you don't get the results that you said you needed to effect it, then the plan and the policy is going to fail. And if it fails, it'll end up costing us because, you know, a budget is a little bit rigid. It's not as flexible as, say, in the private sector where businesses can change budgets almost daily. Governments vote a budget, there's a fixed vote, you can only spend so much money. You have to go out and you got to borrow this money, or you have to create taxation and hope that you will collect your taxes, etc., etc. But while we're on it, let me, for example, give you an indication of what I thought as being as some of the positive things in the budget. And this is where I believe, you know, I was looking at my social media, and I'm a Facebook freak tonight, and I was getting a little pushback in respect of comments I made about the budget on one of your competitors. And you know, I realize that for whatever reason, people in some cases will never see the good side of anything that they oppose, whether it's tribalism or whether they genuinely think that, you know, it's totally wrong. I, as I've said before, like to look at the glass as being half full, not half empty. And that when even my competitors come up with something that I think is positive, I say, well, okay, maybe I should try it too, or maybe I can vary it and do something different. So here, what I see is some of the positive things. First of all, I like the fact that the budget was completed by the first week in June. I can't remember the last time that has happened. The government's year runs to March 31st. And like a business, you should have your results as quickly as possible and your new budget even before the year ends. And waiting until the end of April or going into May means we lose time, because it takes a few months for budget plans to be implemented, and there has tended to be a very slow period between after budgets and summer. And so the fact that this budget was finished and done with by the first week in April, I think was a positive thing. And I've seen in the review of the economy, which is prepared by the Ministry of Finance, that there clearly has been improvement in their ability to forecast and their ability to estimate. And they made reference to that if you read that document, and I think everybody should read these documents. They're very interesting. I like the fact that there are no new taxes. Now, at the end of the day, the decision to review the price cap on gasoline at the pump and to restore government's desired $4 excise tax is in fact a tax. You can't ignore the fact. You can argue about it, but the question is, if it's implemented and it was put in by a particular date and said that's it, then it's going to be in, then it becomes a definite tax. In the budget, they will talk about a review of the price cap periodically over the next year. So, I suppose government, if they wish, can continue to not take the $4, but not have the money to spend on the roads as they're suggested. But the fact is, there are no other taxes beyond that, and that will only become a tax if, in fact, they have to implement it as they said, and if for some reason gas prices don't turn out exactly as they progress.
But up to this evening during the DBS News World on petroleum, the former president of the Petroleum Dealers Association, Evarista Shamari, did say that if the government ceases subsidizing petrol, that gasoline could cost $14 per gallon.
That is correct. That is correct. And that is why I'm saying, instead of getting $4, they admitted that they're only getting $1 something, $1 and change. And they see that as not providing sufficient money to do the infrastructure work that they could be doing. At the same time, they're obviously politically concerned that the price going too high. The one thing I could say about that is it would appear that we're still in an era of stable gas prices. And the projections are, and nobody can really tell what gas prices are going to be, but the projections don't indicate any spikes if things continued along the normal pattern. But we live in the era of Trump. And if he attacked Syria tomorrow and Russia retaliated, gas prices will zoom. And so to that extent, it's something that could work either way. And I believe that for political reasons, government still has the option not to implement it, or not to go up to the $4 and keep the cap at $12.75. But in fact, a lot of the economists have told them in the past that the flow through should be a proper flow through, and that the prices should be passed on, to users users of the products, even if it meant that they might have to adjust other prices that go along with it. So it's a risk. Another good thing is, to me, the provision of some additional sinking fund to pay our debt as time goes on. I think that we used to have a contingency fund that had to be used up during the difficult years, and so it was fully depleted. Building that back up allows us to have money to deal with instruments that mature, and we have a very a maturity profile of debt means there are a lot of instruments coming up, and we've continued to borrow and turn them over. But having that money set aside, is a positive thing, and I think all governments should, in fact, ensure that there is always a little bit of rainy day fund that's set aside for things like that. The economic growth of 2.5% is a very positive thing. As I said, there are a number of factors as to why, but it's good, and the impressive growth of tourism is also a very positive thing because that is our biggest industry. Another thing that is something we've been asking for years, that administrations on both sides of the political fence have talked about of implementing, and some of it had started, was reforms to our financial sector. And it was in the budget, again without any dates as to when it will happen, broadening the scope and making it easier to use multiple sources of collateral, for example, reforming the existing framework for insolvency, and reforming the framework surrounding foreclosure. This has been a problem in our economy that has made it more expensive to borrow, made it difficult for people to access and get new loans because banks have gone into a very conservative mode. And until these reforms are made, it'll continue to be a problem. So the quicker, the better. We've been talking about legislation and all of these fronts for years with the assistance of the World Bank, with the assistance of IMF. And we have a draft Insolvency Act, which is 2 years old. But there's a political aspect of it that governments just don't want to deal with. And so again, it's not been implemented. So if we get those reforms, it will improve our economy, but there will be some pain.
What is that political aspect?
Just to give you one example, the changing the Insolvency Act and moving and improving the framework around foreclosure is going to make it easier for banks to seize and sell the mortgages, the assets, your home that you borrowed money for. Okay, that is the situation in St. Vincent, in Grenada, in most other countries. That banks and are able to do that means they have less bad debts on their books. But from a political point of view, and I'm going back over decades here, governments are very unwilling to give the banks that kind. We have this Napoleonic code that means that if you borrowed money and you can't pay your debt in your house, and the bank says, okay, I'm going to get a judgment against you, it may take them 10 years before they can actually get anything sorted out. And in the meantime, you live in your house. Now, may not have.
Why should the common man have a problem with that?
What you mean the fact that he's safe knowing that the banks can't foreclose? Because it's affecting the economy as a whole. And I would have to say the majority of people are good payers, and they do pay their loans. But not everybody is going to be a winner in that regard. And in the world in which you live in means that in every other part of the world, that there are times in which you just have to accept if you can't pay your debts, you have to deal with it. You put up something as security, you have to give it up.
But sometimes the banks do not act with any
I'm not saying all banks are great.
Yeah.
And yes, you may say it's social conscience, but there are ways and means of dealing with that. I'm not just saying give banks the ability to seize anytime they want. No, you put in restrictions, you put in parameters, the length of the loan, an insolvency act that allows trustees to come in and negotiate. Banks were having to take haircuts where necessary, et cetera, et cetera. We have none of that. And so it means that if you ask the banks now how much money do they have tied up in old mortgages, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's a problem which, and as I said, it increases the cost of borrowing, makes banks less willing to lend, and makes it harder for you to get that same loan to buy your house that would have been easier if they didn't have this problem with the bad debtors. So it's one of those situations where there's good and there's bad, but it doesn't mean to say that you're automatically giving somebody the right to do things that are not going to help the small man. But it also means taking more responsibility when you get into a situation of not borrowing more money than you can repay, and not being more extravagant in your lifestyle and the size of the house that you build, and being realistic about what you can afford.
Your other point, sir?
Well, the only other the program to rehabilitate our national infrastructure is good. I think, if nothing else, it seems to me one of the things that people are particularly happy about, just from talking to people that I know, is that their roads are being fixed. And you know, all over the world, governments know that. You fix roads, you fix infrastructure, people are happy. And so obviously that is having an impact.
I think that the government is learning, this the United Workers' Party administration, as far as this issue is concerned, is learning from the fallout it experienced after the 2011 general election. The roads were really bad in St. Lucia, and in particular in the nation's capital. I mean, you had places around the market and so on with huge potholes, with craters and so on. And people are saying all those little things would have resulted in the government of then Prime Minister Stephenson King losing that general election.
Quite possible. I mean, I can't tell you what the reasons were or not.
But let's not look at it as a reason. But the evidence is there that the roads, leading up to the election, it was really bad. And as soon as the St. Lucia Labour Party came into office in 2011, they started some massive road rehabilitation project. So
there's no doubt that keeping our roads motorable and in good shape is something that is near and dear to people. And you know, the question of, for example, the gas tax that the government imposed last year to provide some of the money, they obviously didn't get all they wanted because of the cap that they put on fuel prices. But it was something that the private sector had actually proposed to Dr. Anthony when he was in power. He was reluctant to do it, and for prudential reasons, he felt that, you know, what would happen if, in fact, gas prices started going back up? Then he'd have to reverse that policy. And so he was a little hesitant to put it in. What he didn't know was that prices would not go up that significantly. So had he put in that gas tax, then government revenues would have been better, and maybe they could have done
and there's a thing about politics, you're not having a crystal ball.
If you did, it would be wonderful. You know, and I guess the other thing that was positive, although I have another aspect of it that I don't like, is the discussion of a national health insurance scheme, which will go into effect, I think, by the end of the year.
The discussion has been going on for much too long, Mr.
Much too long. I mean, you know, it's been going on now at least since the beginning of the year. I was involved back then working with Stephen King, Dr. King, Emma Hippolyte at NIC to put in UHC. And we had got to the point where the biggest problem was how it was going to be financed. Because to come up with a basket of services that everyone would be entitled to if you were covered by a UHC was clearly going to cost government some money. At the time, we were looking at 35 million. Now it's probably twice that. And the problem is, how do you finance that? We didn't have that in those days. And so we looked at everything, including even increasing electricity. There were all kinds of different ways of you know, and none of them proved sustainable. It never got done. Governments changed. They have different ideas, different views. So this one now proposes that it can be done using you know, contributions from employer and employee, with government coming up with the difference to cover those that are not working or are indigent or whatever. It has a very positive impact if everybody can have a health insurance, but there's a negative side which, you know, I'll refer to later on.
No, let's do it now.
Well, okay.
What's the negative?
Here's the negative. I'm an employer, and I have a private health scheme in which all my employees are covered, including myself. They pay, they contribute, and I contribute for them. It's costing me money. But I'm happy, and my employees are happy that they have a health coverage. Now, if you tell me that it's now you're going to increase the level of contributions, both by employee and employer, it's going to be an extra cost to me as an employer, but I already have a plan. So what do I do with that plan? Do I then just tell my employees, you have a national health plan, so I'm going to cancel the private plan? A lot of big companies in the country have private plans. The biggest provider is Sagicor. So they may be the biggest loser from that point of view if everybody decides that that's duplication. And so I'm not going to have a private plan and a public plan, because that's going to be, I'm paying the price, right? The more employees you have is the more contributions you have to pay. That's the downside. And then, of course, what is that basket of health services that is being provided? That's not yet defined. A lot of work has gone into what would be necessary for a reasonable and good health insurance, and that does not cover major medical, which is what happens if you have to be flown out and have a major operation somewhere else. But it's important that a country has national health. But look at the debate that went on in the U.S. over Obamacare. Now what we have is Flambeau-care. There's another version of it, and I think the country needs a national health insurance policy and plan. I still think that there's time to look at how we finance it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through that.
So can your private health plan deal with those serious cases where you need to be flown overseas to deal with, for example, issues relating to cancer and so on? And then the national insurance plan, the local plan, will deal with those issues where you can be readily treated at one of our health institutions.
That may be the option. But I can tell you, I mean, in addition to the plan that we have just for local medical services, I also have a major medical. And that costs, $10,000 to $15,000 US a year.
Oh.
So it's very difficult to get that kind of coverage simply, for every level, every employee. I think a good health insurance plan will have some element of that, because you have to assume not everybody is going to have that problem. And we do have services which we can get from Martinique, from Cuba, and other places. So it doesn't have to be the United States, the Mayo Clinic, or anywhere else like that. It can be done. But it is not, as we've seen in Canada and in England, national health services can often be a drain on the government, and the extent of the subsidies becomes a huge cost, and then taking it away after, or changing it and reducing it becomes a major political problem. So you've got to get this thing right from the start. It has to be properly financed, and the basket of services that is being provided by all hospitals, public and private, because we looked at both, has to be such that you get efficiencies so that it's not just doesn't get bloated, as it is in many countries where it just becomes too expensive to sustain.
There's need for bipartisanship on this issue as well?
I would like to think that both parties can come to some agreement as to what is the best way to do it, but it's not just the politicians. This is where the private sector and individuals need to come into the fray. We need to look at what is, in fact, the most basic needs, that it has to start at a very low level. It has to be preventative rather than just curative, so that, in fact, you have to look at healthy lifestyles so that you avoid and reduce the risk. Maybe start even looking at things like taxing things that give us too much sugar and anything that's unhealthy, so that you reduce the level of sickness in
But it seems like it seems it's a long, drawn-out process based on everything that you're saying. It seems so complicated, so huge.
Yeah, but they've been talking about it for such a long time, and they have advice now from PAHO and a number of other global that it has been implemented in a number of countries in different ways. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
But not everyone will be satisfied at the end. At the end of the day, so that's
Is
where the bickering will come in.
Well, of course, there's definitely going to be some people that disagree. They may disagree on the financing. They may disagree on the level of the packages. They may disagree on how your hospitals are run, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the same with any policy. You're always going to get some disagreement, some differences of opinion. Trying to get that balance of consensus, and then making sure that it works and it's not abused. Because there is a tendency when people, and this happens in the States, people use medical services when they're covered by insurance to the extent that it's totally unnecessary, and that again increases the price because the insurance companies start charging more.
The issue that the government faces right now with the OKEU hospital, that conundrum, talking about private-public partnership.
Right.
What do you think about this?
I'm not opposed to privatization by itself. I believe it has to be properly managed, has to be regulated. And if that is as it stands now, the best way that we can ensure that these hospitals that we have can be run efficiently and can provide the level of services that we need to go along with the National Health Insurance Scheme, then so be it. Let's look at privatization. Not opposed to it. In fact, one of the disagreements I have with the present government is that when they were talking about Huonora, I agreed with the privatization of Huonora, and they did not. And so they have moved away from that, in that regard. At least in that respect, there's a financing mechanism, which is a departure tax. In the case of hospitals, there's no automatic financing mechanism. So, you know, the main concern with privatization is that you manage that contract in such a way that it cannot be abused by the people that are coming in and running it, because there's a tendency in privatization of hospitals for those doing it to want to go for, you know, the high yield type of services, and not offer the kind of the basic stuff, which is what we probably need. So, you know, I think I don't know exactly where they are on the whole project. If we can achieve it, if we're aware of it, if we're transparent about what they're trying to achieve and it can be done, then let's go for it. Because I gather from one or two meetings I held years ago that the cost of running our hospitals is so significant that, you know, I wonder where we're getting the money to do it, quite frankly. It's been one of the reasons why they've been unable to open the Owen King Hospital now for some years, to the horror of the European Union, who provided all the money.
But should we be very circumspect when we're accepting gifts? $167 million gift, that's the cost of the hospital, I think. Because we have the same problem with the Darren Sammy Cricket Ground in terms of maintaining it.
Yeah,
the
that wasn't a gift, by the way.
It
wasn't a gift.
No, but in terms of the cost,
Yeah.
In terms of the George Odlum Stadium, maintaining those structures that are costing several $1 million, it seemed to be beyond us.
Yeah, in hindsight, you know, when you look at whether it be a gift or even if you're going to borrow the money or you're going to do it out of taxpayers' money, if you cannot project down the road what it's going to cost to maintain and have a mechanism to ensure that those costs can be provided, then you're looking at a white elephant. And so, you know, there are times in which you need to either turn it down or to say, you know what, we don't need a huge new hospital. We need like a polyclinic here and a polyclinic there, and that'll do the trick better. But there is a tendency to go for big construction projects, which has quite often created these same white elephants.
Makes you look politically, the optics.
The optics are not great.
You concluded with the positives, or you have more?
Well, no, there are more, but I don't want to spend the whole night. And I've got some negatives. I think, like
let's get into the negatives.
Okay.
Some of your concerns with regard to the budget.
You know, regardless of what political preferences we may have as to the management of the economy and the country, we should never wish an elected government to fail in its plans to grow the economy and to improve, you know, living standards. However, if those policies and plans are not sustainable in the long run, then we should not be reluctant to criticize and to try to change. So to that extent, there are things in the budget that I think create some concern, either that are in it or that are not in it. You know, and I just throw out a couple, and hopefully it's things that other people may have the same feeling about, and maybe the government might change their mind. The biggest one, in a sense, is, are these favorable economic conditions that surround us going to continue? And if they don't, do we have a plan B to compensate? Whether it be an increase in the price of oil and what we have to do in respect of, you know, the pass-through mechanism, whether it be our ability to borrow at favorable interest rates, whether it be problems with economies in the US that affect tourism. We don't know. Natural disasters is the biggest one. Yes, there are proposals to build resilience, but beyond that, you know, it's a question of how do we cope if we went through what Dominica did. You know, there is some, I think there was discussion about insurance capabilities that seem to be positive, but that's one of the big issues about, and it's not a fault of the budget, it's an issue that all governments have to deal with. You know, if the conditions are not on which you base your assumptions are not there, what do you do? The second is whether the measures that have been announced on the question of security will address the rate of crime and antisocial behavior. We had a bad year last year, I think, in terms of murders. I think so far this year seems not as bad, but you know, we still have a problem with crime, as do all Caribbean countries, and we have a problem with white-collar crime. As you've seen now, there's discussions in Lucia being a haven for anti-laundering and whatnot. These are issues we have to deal with. So it's not just crime, it's also, you know, well, it's crime, but it's white-collar as well as physical. The method of financing the health insurance, as I said, you know, that needs to be sorted out in such a way that it doesn't become a burden, both in terms of the costs of operating it in terms of the services that are provided under the health insurance. The absence of constitutional changes. We talk about public sector reform, and the answer is in a lot of those recommendations that were given to the governments by the Constitutional Reform Commission, but neither government seem inclined to even to go for any of them. Maybe there's politics behind it. I'm not too sure, but at the end of the day, if we don't change certain things to deal with, as I say, the public sector reform and campaign financing, then we're going to have these two things, concerning us in years to come. The absence of any proposals on the tax regime for personal income tax has been promised by both the last government and this present government last year. We're yet to see them. And the intention is that we'd see our top rate go down from 30 to 25. We'd see our thresholds, the 18,000 now, you go up to 25 or 30,000. Some management of the actual, your ability as to what else you can deduct. But that's now going to give more individuals a little more disposable income to maybe look after their health, look after their education, etc. Apparently, it seems to be a cost to government. We make now over $100 million a year in personal income tax, and there's a concern, which is one of the reasons why Dr. Anthony didn't implement what he had proposed, that it might have cost too much at the time if he introduced it, so it was not put in. We need to look at that tax reform, as a matter of urgency. The absence of proposals to abate or contain the importation of used and reconditioned vehicles. Politically, they won't touch it, right? Because they know, the governments know how popular it is with the young people and with the taxi drivers.
Why is it necessary that the government do that?
Well, the fact is that Japan and South Korea are dumping their old vehicles in all of these countries. And it creates havoc on our roads in terms of congestion. And it's an environmental problem that will come back to haunt us with all of these old cars hanging around. Where do we put these old cars?
But we do not have a reliable public transportation system.
It's not the public transportation that's a concern here. We didn't have, before all these reconditioned cars came on stream, we had the private transportation scheme that seemed to work. There are ways and means of doing it, of working with reputable, reliable dealers of all sizes and shapes, not just the present ones, motor deal, to bring in the right kind of car and tax it at a rate that people don't have to pay an arm and a leg to be able to buy it. And you can allow used and reconditioned vehicles in, but put in a little discipline into the system so that it can't be older than a certain age, that you can...
But we've tried that before, right?
Tried it before, and it was not popular. And that was a problem, and so when the government changed, they took it off. When the government changed again, they didn't bring it back in. But there needs to be some discipline and reality in the whole question, because as I say, we're becoming the dumping ground for old cars, and it's a problem not just in...
But if the government undertakes such a move, preventing those used vehicles from entering our shores, I mean, it is hurting a particular section of the society.
The word is not prevention, because you're going to allow it, right? People must be free to import
price
things.
it beyond some people, certain people. If you price it beyond certain people.
Here's the problem. From what I understand, I mean, I'm not a dealer, but what I understand is that a lot of vehicles are coming in at prices that are not the real prices, and so government revenues have been affected by that, right? So there's a way of dealing with that. The age of the car, the type of the car, you can control that and still allow a number of cars. You still have freedom to bring in. You can still get a car cheaper than you would be able to buy a new car from a dealer, right? But at the end of the day, the balance provides a little more revenue for government to deal with roads and things like that, ensures we don't have too old cars on the road, but still provides, and then the finance can be available so that people can still afford to get a car. But when they do get that car, it'll be one that they can maintain, it will last, it will not become a wreck on the road after a short period of time. It just has to be managed, like everything else. And I think politically, there's no even mention of it, even though they had discussion with the dealers over this matter, and perhaps they indicated they might have done it. And then I guess, how do we ensure that foreign direct investment and the privatization of government services and national assets will benefit the majority of the people in the country rather than just a privileged few? And how do we ensure that the procurement of goods and services by government and the awarding of tenders will be transparent and equitable? as long as they have perceptions of corruption in procurement and in the awarding of tenders, people will always accuse the followers and the government of corruption. And you hate, whichever government is in, the other side is accusing them of that. I seem to remember years ago, Dr. Anthony talked about introducing something called a
contractor general.
Right.
We have one in Jamaica.
Right. He didn't do it. And I don't know how well it works, to be honest with you. But clearly, there needs to be some improvement in both procurement and in awarding of tenders, if nothing else, to deal with the perceptions that it is only given to the, those who are supporters of the government, and it's awarded and people are getting kickbacks, etc.
Okay, but isn't why some people support the government in the first place or support political parties in the first place?
Of course, and there's no reason why you can't have negotiated tenders. But at some cases, and I'm not saying that this is a major problem that we have, but the perception is the problem. So that when you have big projects, that the whole process can be done in such a way that the price is no more than it has to be. The international people have said in places like Africa, for example, that an enormous amount of the aid and so on that goes into Africa just goes into the pockets of corrupt people. And if we can get rid of corruption, and organizations like Transparency International do a lot of work in this area, then in fact we can reduce the price to everybody and improve the efficiency of government.
So you could tie this with campaign financing?
Campaign financing is an issue we need to address because it's in the States, it's out of hand now. You can buy an election, it appears, and using Cambridge Analytica as well. And so we need to know how, and then what you're getting is foreign governments assisting, parties in their campaigning. I think we need to know who is providing the finance and have some rules and regulations so that too doesn't get out of hand because it's being abused.
You think sometimes the parties, they're just loath to support this particular issue because they believe it will impact them, whether it's the government party or the opposition party.
It's kind of like constitutional reform. When it came up in the House, neither party supported it.
They were very much united on this issue.
And so to that extent, it might be the same in campaign finance. In the States, they threw it out. They had controls. When the present government got in, even before that, they said it constitutionally, you could not prevent people from giving to the party that you like. And so, the whole question, I think it's not a question of prevention as much as it is as the transparency of it, so that that in fact, all right, this is how people are financed.
And those big players, in the end, when they support a political party, that party gets into government, they influence how the government takes initiatives, including the enactment of laws.
Correct. And it's not always wrong, because you can have good campaign donors who really and truly want to bring about a certain almost philosophical change in the way government does its business, and that's fine. But so if they were really just big global organizations that were able to provide to both parties, and so that there was a level playing field. But we all know in life that sometimes there are people that will pay the money and expect to get things that quite honestly they should not be getting.
Is that the extent of your concern, sir?
Well, yes. I mean, like everything else, there are more, but I don't want to overload it neither one way or the other. And I'm not an expert in all of these areas, and I'm not elected. And nobody put me in a position to say what is good or bad, because people will disagree on both sides with what I have said is good or bad. And there are, as I say, there are ways to address in both cases what may be good, what was left out, what may be bad.
You're watching Newsmaker Live, and once again, my guest this evening is Chartered Accountant, Mr. Richard Pittikin. When we come back, your calls, so please stay with us. We conclude at 10 o'clock with the clip. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. If you're just joining the broadcast, my guest this evening is Mr. Richard Pittikin, Chartered Accountant. We put a telephone number on screen right now so that you can call with your questions and comments for my guest. And you can check out our Facebook page as well, TBS TV. Once again, we take your calls right now, and we're focusing on the just concluded budget presentation over in St. Lucia. 2017, 2018, that should be 2018, 2019, $1.4 billion. We have a number of issues to discuss also, but we hope that you'll take the opportunity right now to call in. We do not want to venture into another area and then you would be calling to pose a question or a comment to my guest, Mr. Richard Peterkin. So while we wait, we might as well move on to another issue. And we heard, it was just a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister suggesting that he wanted to reshuffle his cabinet. He has not done that. One would have expected he would have done it before the budget presentation. Do you see the need to do that?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that reshuffling your cabinet, sometimes almost every year, it doesn't hurt. Tonight I heard that Skerritt in Dominica has just reshuffled his cabinet. Trinidad has gone through a similar thing. So I think it's good for the ministers to get experience in different ministries, and for them to get a good feel and. Well,
in the case of Dominica, the Prime Minister had a reason to do that because somebody has just left the opposition party.
Okay.
Became an independent, and I think just a day or two later became a government minister. We have a call. Good evening. This is Newsblinker Live. You're on the air.
Good evening, Tim.
Hi. Good evening to you, caller. Go ahead, please.
I think it's a very good program. However, I want to say something to the accountant. I think economist, if I may want to say. I think he touches a bit on that. I think, Tim, I've heard him, and I think Jeff as well, making some observations every time a budget has been presented. But the problems are still existing, and we seem not to have the solutions. But I think the solutions are there. And let me quickly say this. For example, I heard him talk about the used car. The used car are used importation of used vehicles. I don't think any politician should even venture to go that route.
Why?
Because, Tim, ever since this has happened, the ordinary man who has been struggling has been able to have a measure of independence, to take his family to work, to take his children for a drive, to release the stress and the social outfalls of stressful daily living. And I also want to say, very hastily, the prices of vehicles have gone down. So it says that there has been a gouging by either the dealers or the customs, but somewhere along the line, the people were given a raw deal. That is more or less a regulatory exercise of having the used cars in. And let me say this, I have been concerned about that, and I must be honest, unlike what Mr. Peterkin said here, not that he was dishonest, I have deliberately researched the thing. The derelict cars along the side of the roads were originally bought as new cars. They are not used cars. As a matter of fact, the used cars are better equipped than the new ones which are being brought in. Better equipped by far. And I'm not asking, I'm saying this as a living testimony. The other thing, Tim.
That's a final comment, eh? Go ahead.
Well, let me make this suggestion.
Yeah.
I think all the economists and all the accountants should set up a body and allow the public to come talk with them. They can put those points on paper and make a submission to the cabinet and let the cabinet table a resolution to the parliament. I think this will be very wholesome and expeditiously.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's see.
Yeah, on the last point, that's actually something that the Institute of Accountants have talked about for some time now. They've asked government to whether they can in fact have a little more involvement on budgets and things like that, and we have forums where people are free to come and discuss. But bear in mind on the used car situation, I was not suggesting for 1 second there'd be a restriction, just be proper management. In other words, we are free to import whatever we wish, except cars beyond a certain age, and cars that, let's say, are gas guzzlers and are not going to be efficient in terms of use of fuel or damage to the environment.
Hold that point, sir. My apologies. We have a call. Good evening. Newsmaker Live. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Tim. Good
Hi.
evening, Mr. Peterkin.
Good evening to you, caller.
Sir, I want you to guide me. Would I be wrong in saying that business and government operate or they revolve on the dual axis of profit, not profit, but income and expenditure, and that the only difference there is one alludes to profit and the other alludes to surplus. Will I be correct in saying that, sir?
You are correct, but one of the differences is that there are certain services that the government
I'll
has.
listen on the TV.
Thank you so much for calling. Go ahead.
Yeah, that there are certain services that the government has to provide that it would be almost impossible to make a profit of it. But there are services that taxpayers are providing taxes for governments to do. So to that extent, you cannot run a government entirely like a business on the assumption that every single department, every single service can make a profit. There are some things that people are saying, I want this done and I'm paying for it. So whether it's break even or maybe even slightly subsidized, it's something that's important to us as a whole. And so there must be a distinction between governments and business in that regard.
We have another call. Hello, good evening. You're on the air. Hello. Okay, what was that call? But earlier on, the cabinet reshuffle question.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I didn't know much about the Dominica thing. But as I say, it helps to have ministers move around, even though a cabinet is meeting and discussing things generally. Running a particular ministry is useful, and it helps people to overcome the perceptions that somebody is in one particular ministry and running things their way. In the same thing, like businesses, for example, require that all employees take a vacation, and while they are gone, somebody else comes in and does what they were doing, and quite often that ensures that the things that you were trying to hide come to the point. So I think it's healthy to have reshuffles. Okay,
let's look at the Citizenship by Investment program, the various changes that were made to it, and some of the concerns that are being highlighted by the opposition. Do you think there's need for us to maintain it on the path that it is right now? Because it's very strange that it was reduced, single applicant, to $100,000 from $300,000 US. Yet still we are not doing well.
Well, I don't
as expected.
There is actually a forum on Friday. The Chamber's putting up, having a luncheon seminar, and we're hearing from the CIP people. I think the the adjustment downwards of the price was justified on the basis of that's what the market was desiring. And if that was the case, then presumably we should be getting more. But we're up against other countries that have been in it for a lot longer than we were. I don't know exactly how much money we made on it last year, but it is a major concern because it's clearly affecting our relationships with other countries who believe that these programs have been abused in other countries. And so we're paying a price, in essence, for some of the bad eggs that came through other countries and now are causing the EU and Canada and the US to think twice about people bearing our passports. I mean, our passports are, the one thing you can say is, we are St. Lucians and we have a St. Lucian passport, we're born here, we pay our taxes, etc. There's no reason why you can't have a citizenship and a residency type program, but it has to be so carefully managed to make sure that it's not abused.
On that point, we have a call. Good evening, Newsmaker Live, you on the air?
Yes, I'm happy that the Citizen by Investment thing came up. Mr. Peterkin, do you believe that when we got into that, it was not prudent to get into that at that time because there were so many of these programs around the Caribbean? And the other thing was that it appeared that the government was devoid of ideas and they jumped into this thing. What say you?
Thank you so much for calling.
Yeah, I remember at the time that it came up, they had quite a few, consultations and discussions, and there were a lot of people that were opposed to it. They just did not like the idea that people could buy a passport. The government at the time was running out of options, and they saw the kind of money that St. Kitts, Antigua, Dominica was making, and they believed that if carefully managed, it's a program that could bring some benefits to the country. So that's why they got into it. But there's a comment I want to make on it. Because, as you know, we were put on a blacklist. We just got off that blacklist, but we're still on a grey list. And the problem that the countries, the EU and others are telling us is that we have it's harmful tax avoidance. It's people are using these offshore havens and using the CIP programs to get around, paying taxes in their own countries. And so because of that, we're dealing in a situation we have to operate in the world. And we're finding a lot of pressure from the bigger countries in the world, if we bring in these programs and we don't manage them carefully and properly. So to that extent, we need to be very careful as to how we proceed on this.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for holding on. You're now on the air.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, good evening to you, caller.
My question for Mr. King is basically what, as an economist,
Chartered accountant.
What is his feeling, or chartered accountant, what is his feeling about the economy? Where does he see things going? Is it turning around? Is it positive, or are we continuing to dig ourselves into a ditch? Another question also is, I believe the minister, Mr. Boulders, recently said that there may be a looming increase in the new tax that was implemented on road rehabilitation and gas. I wanted to know what was his thoughts on that and how he believes it will impact on the economy, basically.
Thank you so much.
You're right. So on the first point, as I pointed out, we right now the economic environment in which St. Lucia operates is very favorable. A number of positive things have happened around us. Many of them things we don't really control, but it made it possible for us to have growth and even sustain growth if we use the right programs going ahead. So to that extent, from all appearances, from what the economists in the Ministry of Finance tell us, we have had growth of 2.5, even though not everybody feels it, but clearly there has been some improvement, and if these conditions continue, and if the right policies are used and implemented in time, we hopefully can continue to grow, if not at 2.5%, at a higher rate. On the second part, we discussed that a little earlier. A lot really depends on what happens to the international price of oil going forward. The government is saying that if the price does not increase, that they may, or if it does increase, they may be forced to pass on the higher prices because they need $4 per imperial gallon in excise tax for infrastructure and other things. The reality is that what happens is if the price gets too high, government generally tries to step in to avoid the consumer being hurt by higher prices. We can only sustain that for a time.
We have a call. My apologies. Another call. Good evening. Newsmaker Live, you on the air?
Good evening, Mr.
Hi.
Peter King.
Yes,
Good evening,
sir.
caller.
I've been listening to you.
But that's why you called.
I'm a kind of person I just have respect for everybody. But one thing I just take into consideration, no matter who professional you are, accountant or whoever you are, have to do things in this professional way. What I'm about to say to you, the CIP, this, from what I have heard from the IMF, previous administration, they said that the CIP was one of the best regulatory, etc., in the West Indies or by extension the world. I could recall that when it was set up. Now, all damages are done to the CIP. Bring it down to $100,000, where it was $3 million.
Okay, you have your figures mixed. Okay, it was 300,000 US. Now it's 100,000.
All right. So what I'm saying, when you bring a system, a thing like that to $100,000, at the end of the day, and you have other persons to give 10% or whatever would they have done. At the end of the day, you ended up getting 60,000 or even less. To get passports sold to get a big profit out of it, you have to have a big amount. Okay? Where donations, etc. is concerned. All that was part of the whole CIP program. Okay? What I'm saying to you, if a government on the island Shasby bring down the $100,000, and at the end of the day, you sold 259 passports, where in the region you're supposed to get about $40-something million, and you send to the St. Lucians, you get 41. You know what that says? And no, before I say what I'm going to say, he went further and he said they had to, I think 6 persons or 7 or whichever, they had to revoke their passport because they didn't do due diligence. How can you say you do due diligence, you give people passport, and at the end of the day, you say you do this? They're making sense.
Okay, thanks a lot. What's to his contribution?
Well, I think, you know, when we first got into it, IMF told us at the time that, look, you watch what you're doing because this thing is full of danger, fraught with risks, and, you know, and we've seen it happen in other countries. However, if properly run, it can be beneficial as an option to provide revenues because of declining revenues in other areas. The problem with due diligence is you know, you can only do so much. There are such clever people now that they can get around some of the best due diligence. As long as you continually monitor, you can weed those people out later on in the day. Dropping the price to $100,000 has its risks because, yes, you're right, you now need a lot more at that level in order to get to the level of revenue that you want. But that's not the only option. That's the donation option. There are other options, the real estate option, and the enterprise fund option, and I believe that what they're intending to do is to work with a couple of developers who are saying that they can work with the international marketing people and bring in people who want to invest in their projects. So there is scope for running the project, the program well, but it, as I say, it has a higher level of risk than a lot of other investment policies.
Would it have made a difference if it was the cost was $300,000 US?
Apparently so. Apparently all the research that was done looking at what the other countries were offering indicated to them that they had to drop the price. St. Kitts has since dropped their price.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, in some cases, it looks like a race to the bottom because it looks like we're cheapening a product just because we, you know. But it's unfortunately demand and supply, you know, and there are some people out there, you will always have that donation element of their CIP program. And if, you know, they're saying, look, I really and truly, I need another passport, I'm a clean, individual, and, you know, but I don't need all the other things that go with it. So if I can get it for 100,000 in Dominica, then I'll go there.
Let's take a call. Good evening, Newsmaker Live, you're on the air. Hello, good evening. Okay, Mr. Producer, help us, please, because I could hardly hear the caller.
Hi, caller.
Yes, go ahead, please.
We need you to be where you are tonight a little bit more often. And we're looking at where we go from here. Bananas are virtually gone. What, in your opinion, could be a substitute to bananas that would generate a household economy to us, as we know bananas to have been? And two, looking at the Vieux-Fort project, a man like you of your caliber, I think you've perhaps give it a fine tooth comb. What advice do you have on that project? Because there seems to be so much confusion over it, and we, the nation, are wondering whether it's good for us or not.
All right, thanks a lot.
Well, on the question, I wish I knew what agricultural project we could kind of use as a replacement for bananas. There isn't any automatic, but I think we need to concentrate on food security and producing food locally for the tourism industry and for our own selves, rather than just assume that we'll always be able to export. And in the case of St. Jude's,
No, DSH, the DSH project.
Oh, it's a DSH. Okay. No, well, I can't really talk about DSH. I'm conflicted. But I say this much.
Conflicted why? You have a few clients there?
I have a client.
You have what?
I have a client.
Oh, client. All right.
But in the case of anything, any big major projects, the government comes in. I think the one way to get around the concerns and the perceptions, the bad perceptions that people may have about it, is to bring in reputable international organizations that will at least give the public, their own opinion as to whether it's sustainable, whether we can afford it, and ensure we don't go down the wrong road.
Another call. Good evening, Newsmaker Live, you on the air?
Yeah, good evening, Tim.
Hi, good evening to you, sir.
And Mr. Peter Kane.
Hi.
All right. It's a fact that there's the inextricable link between sporting performance in the sporting arena and economic fortune. I mean, Jamaica, to name one such state that benefits tremendously from exporting prowess. Mr. Peterkin, can you put your finger on the main reason or the reasons why St. Lucia, we just don't seem to be performing, especially in, track and field. We just, I mean, it seems either flat or getting worse. And all little states, you could see them making progress. Can you put your finger on what we're not doing that has us in that situation? And we're missing out on an opportunity for our youngsters in this country.
Thank you so much for calling, sir.
Well, I spent 20 years as the president of our National Olympic Committee trying to provide that answer. And when I left, I still didn't have it. And everything we did to help athletes, we still didn't produce the level of performances that, is really required. We underperform, let's face it, as St. Lucia. We don't do as well as, look at Grenada. Grenada just got a gold medal in the Commonwealth Games in decathlon. And a guy who came third, I think it was, or fourth. So it shows it's not just size, it's just as your population. It's neither is it necessarily the wealth of the country, because Jamaica, Cuba have both done extremely well. It has to do with the sporting culture, the attitude of the government, the provision of facilities, and the assistance that is given to athletes to encourage them to start young, to stay committed, and to know that when it's all done, you still have a future and a job.
Our final call. Good evening, you're on the air. Hello? Okay, we have lost the caller. Let's take the final comments from you, sir.
Well, as I said before, a budget is just an announcement of a government's particular plans, priorities, policies, and this is what this budget is. We shouldn't be, necessarily watching it as a cure-all for our problems. It's just what government proposes to do. The positive thing, I think, is that we're living in we're going through some, positive economic environment that we exist in that gives us the opportunity to put in the programs and have the priorities and implement the things that we need to improve our economy, to grow the country, and to improve our living standards. So let's just hope that, in fact, the good plans are positive and that they are successful, and that the ones that are not so good are given up as a result of information and concerns that people express, and that the country can, in fact, get together perhaps more than it is now, so that, we can all feel that we're doing something for the future of St. Lucia.
But do you think it's a tough ask, saying that
it's a
the
tough
country to come together?
It's a tough
This will
ask.
not happen, irrespective of which party is in office.
Yeah,
it just will not happen.
You will always have a certain degree of opposition, of people who will never agree, and philosophical sometimes, as well as economic. But it's not impossible to, but what it requires is constitutional change to allow more people in the country, in the economy, to take part in the dialogue and the consultation as to what, in fact, has to be done.
And the Prime Minister, the United Workers' Party in opposition, did promise to look at constitutional reform and so on, looking at the recommendations. Do you think that will just be another process whereby it will just cause the whole exercise to linger? Because if you're going to review the recommendations all over again and then determine whether you're going to implement...
I'm pessimistic, sadly, because I've seen, even in cases like St. Vincent, when they had a referendum, it failed.
Yeah.
And so politicians are very wary of a referendum that might be necessary to institute true constitutional change. And in other instances, they justify the need not to do it. And so we just don't do it.
Chartered Accountant Richard Peterkin, thank you so much for being my guest on this evening's Newsmaker Live.
Thank you, Tim.
It was definitely a pleasure. And to you, thank you so much for watching the broadcast and contributing via your calls. If it's Wednesday, it's Newsmaker Live. Time now for the clip that peaked.
This is 25 years of battles and wars. Oh, no. Lesnar going to go for a ride, perhaps. Oh, no. But Lesnar with 10 on his
AJ Styles unloads a right hand quickly. Wow. He's been doing that since the beginning of the match. Pedigree! Incredible resurgence!
I think Styles thought he had it won.
Oh, and Cena again lifts AJ Styles. Styles counters. And now Styles looking for the Styles clash. Styles clash. This could be it.
Great. This is awesome. John Cena.
It is electrifying. It is
Revolution's animal.
Wait a minute. What are you doing, Batista? What are you doing?
My God.
If you do this, there's no turning back. Has served up a bevy, none as great as this. Cena gets Styles again. Oh, Mamma Mia!
He's back in this ring.
Oh, my God! He about to count it. Oh, look at this. He's out of control right here. Randy Orton. Whoa! Randy Orton with an RKO out of nowhere.
Once again, it's a very good evening. My name is Timothy Polio. See you next time.